Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to discuss the Vatican, the Holy See. And for the first time ever, I'm going to publicly be critical of a sitting Pope, Pope Francis. Now, the reason it's unusual for me personally is because I am a Del Rovere. It's a very old Italian family, closely entwined with the Roman Catholic Church. It produced two major popes, including those that built the Sistine Chapel and later had Michelangelo paint it, founded the Swiss Guard, which exists to this day, and many other things as well. And on top of that, I've spent almost 6 months at the Vatican when I was doing my honours thesis, not related to religion, but on Australia's political relationship with the Holy See. At that time, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd had just opened Australia's first permanent mission at Rome for the Holy See. The ambassador appointed was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Tim Fischer, from a diametrically opposed political party. So this was a bipartisan effort. This was a hugely impactful experience for me personally. I met all kinds of extraordinary and accomplished individuals. There are around 70 other embassies operating at the Holy See. Now, you wouldn't necessarily understand the rules, but you can't have your same embassy to Italy be the one that is to the Holy See. That is a rule that the Curia has put down. So if you want to have a permanent embassy there, it has to be separate, a separate building, a separate ambassador, separate credentials, meaning that most of the activity that goes on there is with among themselves. It's like a mini United Nations within the Vatican City. In order for the criticisms I'm about to lay out to hold any validity whatsoever, we have to hold Pope Francis to a different level of accountability as we would another head of state. If we saw the same behavior from the head of Bhutan or Chad or Argentina, it wouldn't be an issue at all. But because it is the Vicar of Christ, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church and the absolute monarch of the Holy See, it's a different category and the criticisms hold. Why is that? Well, the first question we should ask ourselves is, why is Vatican City a state? I don't mean the chronology of the history of how the papal states were given up and the formation of Italy and they were given sovereignty over Vatican City. That is a fascinating story, but not what I'm talking about here. My question is, why is it that we could say conclusively that Vatican City has international sovereignty despite not having the prerequisites we would normally associate with nation states? There aren't any Vaticanians. There are no permanent population. The territory itself is extremely small, some 500 acres for the entire Vatican City territory. It's completely surrounded by another globally recognized state, Italy. And yet the global recognition is near total. 185 of 195 states within the United Nations accepts that the Holy See is an international sovereign power. Well, the answer is that the sovereignty of many of these other countries is diluted by the power of the Holy See and the Pope himself. That being that he holds sway over the hearts and minds of a couple of 1 billion people around the world, many living in countries that are predominantly following this faith. Now, if you go historically in Europe, the concept of sovereignty was something that was doled out by the Pope to the various monarchs by saying that there is a divine right. God himself has anointed this individual to rule a particular territory, and the people that live there owe their allegiance, the legitimacy of that leader, to this coronation, to this anointing by Christ through the Pope. Now, that's no longer the case, and yet many countries around the world are predominantly Catholic, and their leaders often appeal to religious ideas and legitimacy in order to gain votes to then govern. The Pope could say to another country's population, you no longer owe allegiance to a particular figure who has been separated from the church through interdiction or excommunication, and therefore those people, many of them, not all, many would rise up in revolt. So what makes the Holy See unique and special but also legitimate is, despite having a tiny geographic size, the influence wielded by the Pope extends all around the world. It also has one of the world's largest bureaucracies operating in all of these countries through pastoral work, through the hierarchical church institution of the priesthood. The priests are one of the world's biggest intelligence networks. They get information from everywhere from Brazil to the Philippines. And so the church has enormous power over these states around the world. And then, of course, there is the success of Catholicism. In many countries, particularly in Europe, religion seems to be this sort of archaic institution. It's withering away, mostly for old people. But that is not the case in many parts of the world. Take Africa, for instance. More people are converting to Catholicism in Africa than is even the case with a rapidly expanding population. The sheer numbers of Catholics around the world has exploded, as is the proportion of the world that is Catholic. It may not seem the case if you're in Ireland or France or Spain, but certainly the case in many other parts of the world. Well, is it enough that the Pope has this power? Is it purely a ceremonial role? No, the Vatican state is the last absolute monarchy in Europe. The Pope's word is law. He has absolute dominion over that territory and has the power to shift things. Of course, he has a difficult bureaucracy to work through, but he has that authority. And at those points in modern history where the church has been at the absolute pinnacle of its influence, it has been when it has used that power for good. And the greatest pope in modern times was John Paul II. John Paul II was elected pope in 1978, the height of the Cold War, as the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. He's from Poland, and his first overseas trip as pope was back to Poland. And when he went to Poland, despite the threats from the Soviet Union of retaliation, he stood up publicly in front of hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and said, "Do not be afraid." Words that became the rallying cry for solidarity, the freedom movement that liberated Poland at the end of the Cold War. And with the full moral weight of his office, Pope John Paul II threw himself into supporting liberation movements around the world. I will list off just a few key instances, by no means exhaustive, of what he did during his papacy. So in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, his encyclical Sestimenus Annus, Pope John Paul II wrote, quote, "The historical experience of socialist countries has sadly demonstrated that collectivism does not do away with alienation, but rather increases it, adding to it a lack of basic necessities and economic inefficiency." Prior to this, in Nicaragua in 1983, John Paul II publicly reprimanded a priest, Ernesto Cardenal, who was serving in the Sandinista government, thus openly opposing the Marxist government's oppression of the church. In a personal meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987, John Paul II insisted on the legal recognition of the Catholic Church in the USSR. And then beyond his visit to Poland in 1979, he famously stood against the Berlin Wall. And he wasn't just a political activist. John Paul II was a liberation theologian. He looked at the role that Marx may or may not play in Christian theology, and he had this to say. Quote, "The theologies of liberation, which reserve credit for restoring to a place of honor the great texts of the prophets and of the gospel in defense of the poor, go on to a disastrous confusion between the poor of the scripture and the proletariat of Marx. In this way, they pervert Christian meaning of the poor, and they transform the fight for the rights of the poor into a class fight within the ideological perspective of the class struggle." He understood that the religious dimension of the poor, that is, people who simply did not have basic needs, irrespective of any group class identity, he treated every individual as an individual soul, a child of God, and did not base them around class. And he expressly rejected those group identities. It is extraordinary thought from a man who himself had suffered under communist dictatorship and fought resolutely to bring it down. Now let's just compare and contrast that with the current Pope, Pope Francis, and how he has reacted with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the complete, unprovoked war of aggression. Let me talk about some of the things that he has said about this conflict. In an interview with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera in March 2022, Pope Francis said that he had asked Patriarch Kirill of Moscow to use his influence to stop the war in Ukraine. Good. However, he also said that he did not want to make a geopolitical analysis of the conflict, i.e. he wanted to be neutral. In an interview with the Jesuit magazine La Civiltà Cattolica in June 2022, Pope Francis said that the war in Ukraine, quote, was perhaps somehow provoked by NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe. He also said that Russia had miscalculated. Not that they had committed an unprovoked act of territorial aggression, and that NATO was a defensive alliance that had been forged to resist communism, something that his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, resolutely fought his entire career, but in fact that it was the West's fault of expanding NATO, mentioning nothing of the free determination of those countries that had hitherto been occupied by the Soviet Union in their free will of joining this multinational organization. He put the onus on the expansion of NATO for the invasion of Ukraine. Then, in a speech to ambassadors accredited to the Holy See in January 2023, Pope Francis said that the war in Ukraine was a crime against God and humanity. Yes. However, he also said it was important to avoid a simplistic analysis of the conflict. It is the role of the Pope to provide moral clarity. He shouldn't be everything to everybody, and he's kidding himself if he thinks that his role is to mediate this crisis. Neither country is a Catholic country. They're both Orthodox. And meanwhile, he debases the currency of the Roman Catholic Church, notably the idea of its moral legitimacy, its moral power. Now, of course, in recent times, the Catholic Church has received a rightful battering because of all the abuse issues that have come to light, but one could argue that it has moved past that to a degree and is now refocusing, reorienting itself to its traditional role, which gave it that international power to begin with. And then, of course, there's China, the communist dictatorship superpower that is threatening the world freedom, controls its population with a social credit system, enslaves 1 million Uyghurs, is expanding its territory in the South China Sea, has enslaved Hong Kong, is threatening Taiwan, and yet in 2018, Pope Francis concluded a deal with China that would allow China, the Chinese Communist Party, to nominate bishops for the Catholic Church to veto if necessary. That is, the bishops are not assigned by Pope Francis in China, the only country in the entire history of the world where that would be the case, and instead would be raised by the Communist Party, with the idea that loyalty to the Communist Party and to the Communist state is a fundamental prerequisite for any bishop operating in China. This is a deal that is hanging around Pope Francis's neck and has been publicly criticized by the Archbishop of Hong Kong himself. This is the complete capitulation of the Holy See's status as a sovereign nation state, because the basis of that power is the Pope's ability to appoint bishops around the world. And so yes, what did Pope Francis even get out of this deal? China remains one of only 10 countries in the world that still, despite that agreement, doesn't recognize the Holy See. It's the only major country not to. The others on that list are things like Tuvalu or Afghanistan, not major players. So Pope Francis has relinquished the single most powerful tool that the Catholic Church wields in other countries directly, that being the appointment of clergy. And in so doing, not only getting into bed with the Chinese Communist Party, but getting very little in return. Now, let's be clear about this. The Chinese Communist Party is only making this deal because it hasn't been able to contain the spread of the underground church. That is, parishioners converting to the faith themselves. There are now more Christians in China than members of the Communist Party. What makes the office of Pope different to other religious heads is because it is universally recognized as the source of authority and truth for Catholic doctrine worldwide. It's the role of the Pope to provide moral clarity and absolute position on controversial issues, even if you personally don't agree with the position that he takes, whether it be contraception, family planning, same-sex marriage, or what have you. You may disagree on certain aspects of Catholic doctrine, but it is absolutely not the role of the Pope to debase the currency through moral cowardice or trying to play both sides. He should absolutely stand up against injustice and oppression wherever and whenever it occurs. Now, young people today won't remember a time when the position of Pope was respected regardless of your own religious views. John Paul II was universally admired for his personal courage, his steadfast determination, his resolute iron courage in the face of enormous pushback and pressure to be silent, and yet he refused to do so, and in standing with those who were oppressed, He earned recognition around the world, regardless of the denominational religiosity of the people he was speaking to. He seemed and was a man of great courage and integrity. Pope Francis is a complete flake, and I must draw the conclusion that he sympathizes with Russia in this war. He blames the expansion of NATO for the reason the war has broken out, and I think we can debunk that entirely and have on many occasions. And then on top of that, he says a lot of things that would be sympathetic to Marxist viewpoints. I'm not accusing the Pope of being a Marxist. One can generously interpret his statements as Christian, looking after the poor, making sure that those that are victims of the excesses of capitalism are not left behind. These are all things that most people can get behind. You don't want things to be too unequal. You want there to be a reward for effort for people to gain a degree of inequality through their own contribution and value to society, but not deny people opportunities or create corruption at the top. This is all perfectly fair. But Pope Francis continues to make statements that really buttress the border of socialist Marxist ideology, which Pope John Paul II resolutely opposed without denying the Christian need to look after those that are vulnerable and less fortunate and dispossessed or left behind by social changes or the hierarchies in our capitalist systems. Pope Francis was not a good choice. One hopes that when the Pope passes and there is a new election with the Curia, they choose someone who has a bit of fortitude, perhaps someone a little bit more militaristic in their stridency when it comes to defending values. You may not agree with those values, but like any conviction politician, you can love them or you can hate them, but they are far more impressive than those that refuse to take a position and only follow the whims of what they think will make them popular, regardless of what they believe to be right and wrong, or even don't know what they believe to be right and wrong. I'm critical of Pope Francis because he has the power to take on a leadership role in rallying support for Ukraine and its war of liberation, to support and redouble the efforts of Catholic countries like Poland and Lithuania and use them as an example for other Catholic countries to follow in order to defeat tyranny and liberate Ukraine from foreign invasion, just like he would be able to do with steadfast commentary against the Chinese Communist Party. I think the next Pope should tear up that agreement and be openly critical of China, not compromise on whether or not a bishop can be appointed by the Vatican, as has been the case for thousands of years, and instead stand up for the sovereignty, the reason why the Holy See is recognized internationally, and not prove to its detractors that it doesn't deserve to be a country. That's my view. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening. Put your comments down below, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.